ladies, gents, and non-binary mates, and welcome back to Beauty in the Bookcase, where we take a book and we make a look. Now, before we get started, make sure you follow me on all of my social media so you know exactly what I'm getting up to when I'm not here on YouTube. So today's video is all about a book called Mexican Gothic. So Mexican Gothic was written by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, who was born in Baja California in Mexico, but she currently lives in Canada. So Silvia actually studied science and technology before going into writing and publishing, and she's always had a bit of a fascination with kind of weird fiction. It's what she specializes in, and it definitely plays a role in this story. She started off publishing short fiction, and her first novel, her debut novel, was actually published in 2015. Since then, she's gone on to publish a few more novels, and she actually started a weird fiction kind of focused anthology. I don't know, like she works with like specifically fungi fiction, so like fiction about mushrooms, but it's like horror type stuff. And that definitely plays a part in today's story. So this novel actually takes place in the 1950s in Mexico, obviously, hence Mexican Gothic. And we start off being introduced to our main character, Noemi Toboada. So Noemi is, you know, your typical kind of socialite. She's young, she likes to go out, she likes to flirt, she's not very serious about anything, really. And of course, you know, she comes from a wealthy family. But we're also, you know, we also gather that, you know, she's quite a fiery character. She likes to impose herself, and she doesn't really like being told what to do or how to act, etc., etc. However, Noemi had a cousin. Her name is Catalina, and Catalina actually got married to this kind of wealthy English man who had come to Mexico with his family a long time ago. But recently, she actually sent a note over to Noemi's dad that was a little concerning. You know, she was kind of implying that her husband was trying to poison her, and whereas Noemi and Catalina used to be really, really close, they hadn't, you know, really stayed in touch much since Catalina had gotten married and left. So this was obviously cause for concern, and Noemi's dad decided to send her off to this mansion in the mountains called High Place, which is where her cousin was, to kind of get to the bottom of things and see, like, is your cousin just like losing her mind, or is there actually something sinister going on? So once she's in the house, Noemi kind of starts to notice quite an oppressive air to the house. Not only, you know, is she kind of like cloistered up in there just like her cousin, but the woman who runs this house, Florence, she's very particular about how she likes things done, and there's a much more restrictive way of life than what Noemi is used to, so she's obviously not very happy being, you know, kind of told what to do, and, you know, not feeling at liberty to come and go and do as she pleases. But there's also this like weird fungi that just covers the house, and it really makes Noemi quite unsettled. Now, one thing that Noemi kind of notices pretty quickly when she gets there is, well, kind of the racism that makes up kind of that Doyle mentality. We're quickly introduced to Howard Doyle, who is the family's patriarch, and he sure has some interesting opinions. You know, he thinks it's completely appropriate to tell Noemi that her, you know, European genes are what set her aside from other Mexicans and kind of add to her beauty and make her almost like a perfect specimen, so to speak. And this is, you know, this is not a very subtle thing. He says it exactly like that. You know, he's very blunt about it. And he also kind of just has books on like eugenics around the house, so we'll get into that later. But, you know, she's kind of just overcome by the power of the house and of the Doyles, particularly Howard and Virgil, her cousin's husband. And of course, you know, there's kind of, she starts having these like weird dreams, and she feels like the walls are moving, and there's all this like weird stuff going on. But then she is kind of helped by the very understated and sweet Frances, who is the youngest of the Doyles. Honestly, the deeper you get into this book, the weirder it gets. From family murders to weird pacts with the occult, and even this weird genetic obsession, this tale is sure to have you checking that the walls in your house aren't breathing too. Now, before we really get into the good stuff, I do feel that I want to point out a couple of things about this book that kind of bothered me, that I didn't really enjoy. I wouldn't say that it bothered me, but there were things that I wasn't like, I don't know. They kind of interrupted my experience of the book. So the first one was, you know, when I picked this book up, I was really excited to get to have this like Gothic story that was, you know, about Mexico. It was gonna be this very Latino story that, as a Latina, you know, we don't usually get Gothic stories told about us for a variety of reasons. So I was really, really excited to get to have that opportunity to have a context that's usually quite European and have it be turned into something Hispanic and Latino. But really, there's not that much of Mexico in Mexican Gothic. You know, I understand that, of course, this book was trying to emulate the usual conventions of Gothic fiction, but surely there was a way to do that that, you know, could still represent Mexican culture and, you know, just kind of do a better job of creating this world than books like American Dirt did. However, the novel really only spends a little bit of time outside of the house. So, you know, we get a few pages of Noemi's life in kind of the city before she's shipped off to High Place, and then, you know, this book could have taken place anywhere. This could have been any Gothic novel at any point in time, because, you know, you had an English family, so of course everything felt very European. So, you know, the fact that Noemi is basically inside this house the entire time leaves very little space for Mexico and its people and its culture to take kind of like a front seat in the story. That said, you know, I do feel that to some extent this might have been, you know, kind of like a conscious choice. You know, colonialism, and we'll get into that a little bit more later on, does play a big part of this story, so it makes sense to kind of explore that idea of the English taking over everything and kind of suffocating or, you know, delegating the very Mexican culture and themes to a second place. But I think even if it was something that was done intentionally, I think it was just really, I really wish we could have gotten a bit more of that Hispanic flavor, and for that I was kind of looking forward to. Even if we were in this very big environment, I think seeing a conflict, even just like a cultural clash between this very English house and this very specific way of life that the Doyles had versus Noemi's life, and kind of having Mexican culture kind of play a little bit of a bigger role in it. Other than that, other people have drawn comparisons between this book and different things. People have, you know, mentioned that it's similar to some like Guillermo del Toro stuff or Rebecca. I personally just kept thinking about the Yellow Wallpaper the entire time. And the thing is, you know, there's really only so many stories to tell out in the world, you know? So I know that being like, I wanted something 100% original, never before seen, whatever, is a big ask. But the whole point of literature is, you know, you can draw parallels and be like, oh, well, if you've enjoyed this book, you might like this other book because it's similar in like theme or genre. But it really just kind of felt like a much more drawn out version of the Yellow Wallpaper. So I wish that would have been more of like an afterthought, like something that after I finished reading it, I was like, oh yeah, that did remind me of that, instead of spending the entire book kind of going like, I'm just reading the Yellow Wallpaper, but in Mexico, you know? But now let's get into the major themes that I found really, really interesting in this story. And the first one, of course, was the whole kind of conversation around eugenics and colonialism. You know, as you know, I'm an avid reader, I would say, but I tend to go for things that are quite rooted in reality. I like things that take the time to really reflect on like real life as opposed to like, you know, the supernatural or stuff like that. So it was really cool that one of the horror elements of this book was very much based on that idea of like race issues and eugenics and colonialism. You know, the moment the Doyles kind of set foot in this town called El Triunfo, things quickly started to go awry for the people who actually lived there, for the, you know, native Mexicans who lived there. And soon enough, you know, the mines kind of started to dry up and collapse, and it was this jarring image of these rich English colonizers living in this massive house, living very comfortably, kind of having everybody work for them, having the locals work for them, while they lived, you know, in poverty. And as somebody who lives in a country that is still very much a colony, it felt very real to me. You know, it was something that was quite accessible to me, that whole idea of like the wealthy, the people who own the organizations and the companies and whatever and run everything are doing really, really well. And it's quite jarring to then, you know, turn around and go from like, you've just driven through like a gated neighborhood full of mansions and now there's like houses that are condemned and have tarps instead of roofs, you know? So, you know, this book doesn't really hold back very many punches when it comes to discussing issues of eugenics and colonialism, you know? It's very obviously there, you know, it's maybe a little bit too on the nose at times, where it'll talk about like the books being on the shelf and, you know, everything kind of Howard Doyle says is just like the most Eurocentric bullshit you've ever heard in your life, and it's all about like, oh, Europeans are so much better, and like, you know what I mean, if you didn't have a French mom, like your genetics would be garbage. But, you know, it's this kind of eugenic fantasy, so to speak, that really ends up putting initially Catalina in danger and then puts Noemi in the same danger. It's this whole idea of creating a master race that can take over and dominate the like lesser Hispanic people of Mexico. That said, you know, I know y'all aren't here to hear about the terrible, terrible perils of colonialism and how that's a massive evil in society. We'll leave that conversation for another time. So let's talk about the actual spooky shit that's going on in this book. So it's very much like a culty kind of vibe, you know? There's a lot of like just weird shit. Now, I will say, you know, I do like horror. I watch quite a bit of it. I don't think I've read as much as I would have liked to, but we're gonna change that. So, you know, if you're looking for something kind of like, I guess like traditional, like slasher film type of horror, like if you're expecting to see blood and guts everywhere, I wouldn't say that this is the book for you. That said, I don't think that's necessarily like a bad thing. I would align this book a little bit more with like a psychological thriller than I would with like a horror movie, if that kind of contextualizes it for you. But I think it still does something really interesting to kind of like just make you feel a little bit unsettled and uncomfortable. So, you know, one of the main kind of like components, I guess, of the spookiness of this book is the use of ghosts throughout. So there's a lot of ghosts in these houses, between like people who are basically like stuck in time because they haven't been able to move on from their very traumatic deaths, to kind of like actual hauntings that are disturbing and freaky and kind of playing into Howard's power. So we see them play kind of like a big role in like unraveling the background, I guess, of who the Doyles were or how things came to be this way in the house. And then they also kind of just play a role in helping contain anyone who enters this home, right? So they're both trying to help and hinder our protagonist. However, quite frankly, these ghosts are like the least of our worries, and they're the least spooky thing that probably happens in this house. Maybe I just say that because there's also ghosts in my house, so I'm used to them. But yeah, I mean, obviously the biggest threat throughout this entire book is very much Howard and whatever weird, messed up, dark universe he's kind of gates of hell he's opened up in this house. So Howard did some weird cult stuff that I'm gonna leave for you to uncover because, well, what's the fun of me spoiling that? But essentially, like, Howard and the house and anyone who's in the house, kind of via this fungus that's everywhere, like, they become one. Like, Howard controls everything, and the house is almost like a living being through Howard, if that makes sense. But then, of course, you know, kind of the, I guess, the running horror element, or kind of like the big point that, I don't know how to describe it. I guess just kind of like the main thing that's meant to spook you are the fungi, which obviously if I just abstractly say it like that, it's just kind of like, why would I be scared of mushrooms? But they're used very interestingly. You know, they have this presence that is, I don't know, almost like omnipresent. They're everywhere. They're literally mushroom, you know, there's like mushrooms outside, and Francis does, like, he makes like art prints with these mushrooms, and they're literally like growing on the walls, and like they are everywhere, and they become quite an oppressive force, I guess that's the word I'm looking for. And I don't know, I mean, I didn't really see them as something scary, but more like, I think there's like an ominousness to them, you know, like it just made me feel like there was just, like, I was gonna stop reading this book and there was just gonna be fungus like growing in my hair or something, because it was so like it permeated everything. That's the word I'm looking for. And along with that kind of repetition of the fungus, there is this running theme of the Ouroboros, which is like this symbol of like a snake or a dragon eating its own tail. They specifically used snakes, like the snake one in this book. And, you know, I was kind of looking into it, like, they can symbolize a lot of things, but some of the main things that they were going for were the ideas of fertility, life, death, and rebirth. And I thought that was really interesting to see, because that's definitely very much in the Doyle's, like, DNA, and kind of like in what Howard is trying to accomplish. He's trying to have this like chain of reproduction, so to speak, that makes possible this like master race he's trying to create. There's this whole idea of like the Doyles never, like their lineage not dying out and stuff like that. And and then the whole idea of rebirth and, you know, life and death, there's definitely a big role to play there with Howard himself, and kind of like the power and the longevity that he draws from the house. Now, really the last point that I wanted to talk about was kind of the romance or love aspect of this novel. And I know I like to go on Goodreads whenever I'm reading something and kind of see what, you know, what people enjoyed and stuff that kind of took them out or whatever. And it was really interesting because a lot of people were a little bit like confused, or they didn't really understand the purpose of like the romance aspect of this novel. And I get it, you know, this was very much kind of in the vein of your, you know, everyday feminist kind of narrative, so it seemed kind of an odd choice, I guess, to put a love interest, because, you know, a lot of these stories tend to focus on women not needing relationships, not needing kind of like a man or a partner to be fulfilled or to survive certain circumstances. But I honestly didn't really mind. I wouldn't even say that I didn't mind it. I enjoyed kind of the romance aspect of it, because it was done in a way that I think still served that kind of feminist goal. You know, we tend to have a lot of, you know, the men are kind of tough guys, you know, they're quite macho and they're there to save the day, right? They're your cliche kind of like buff guy who's ready to kick ass and save you, you know, save the damsel in distress. But it was super interesting because Francis is very much the opposite of that. He's very soft-spoken, and he's very gentle, and he's quite awkward. He doesn't really know how to interact with women because he's been trapped in this house his whole life, and he's clearly attracted to Noemi, but he's, I guess, a little anxious being around her. And I think it's having this kind of soft-natured attitude. It counters and it balances really well with Noemi's kind of prickliness, you know, and you still have these like very cliche macho characters. Mostly, you know, you have Virgil and Howard as well. You know, they're both your stereotypical kind of like men's man. And you can tell that does not that does not float Noemi's boat. She's not into that kind of, I guess, traditional, like, she's not into traditional masculinity, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And you know, you have that so well countered with Francis, because, you know, he's like this soft-spoken dude who likes to make art with like mushrooms, and he's just awkward and he's a bit of a pushover. So Noemi can still be the heroine. She can still kind of be in charge of the situation, but still find somebody that she cares about without them having to be the person that's coming in to save the day, and more so she's saving her cousin, herself, and Francis as well. And what I really enjoyed about this approach as well was just the fact that it added a layer of humanity to the Doyles. You know, I think one of the pitfalls that we often see in this type of narrative is that the villains almost become too unrealistic, because, you know, they're just kind of like, they're just 100% bad. And, you know, life isn't so black and white, and I think there's a huge danger in having kind of like flat, you know, black and white type of villains, because, you know, then it's just almost absurd. You know, it's a little too on the nose. It's a little too much like, this is obviously the good guy, this is obviously the bad guy. Who are you gonna root for? So I think having that added layer of humanity through Francis really adds, I don't know, I think it was just good to see that the Doyles weren't condemned to be evil, and they could still fight that power. So it was very much a conscious decision to be kind of rotten like that. So yeah, I'll be honest, when I first started reading this book, I read it about 4 months ago. I didn't really click with it. I didn't think it was bad, but I was also kind of like, it's whatever. I don't know if it's like a book that I want to talk about. But kind of going back over my notes and really exploring these themes that I was, you know, kind of interested in, helped me kind of appreciate it a lot more. Like, I wouldn't be like, oh my god, I love this book, it's like my #1 book, or, you know, whatever. But granted, it's also not like the genre that I'm used to reading anyway, so it makes sense that obviously, you know, not like, wow, oh my god, like, it's the best book ever, because it's not really like what I normally go for. But I genuinely did think that it had a lot of interesting points to make, and I really enjoyed kind of going back over it and seeing kind of these more like realistic human everyday experiences in it. And I think a lot of that does come from, you know, the romance aspect as well as the kind of colonialism, eugenics aspect of it. So, I mean, yeah, it being classified as like horror, I don't know. I feel like it was kind of, like I said, it had more of like the vibe of a psychological thriller for me. But I think it was still a really interesting book, despite the fact that, you know, it did kind of miss the mark on kind of that Hispanic, Latino element I was really looking forward to. And the fact that it does kind of feel maybe a little bit too close for me in terms of, you know, the content to the Yellow Wallpaper. And, you know, one of the things that really stood out to me when I was kind of thinking what I wanted to make this video about was realizing how much I actually remembered from the book. You know, when I really don't enjoy a book, I'm like, I know I read it, but I can't tell you a single plot point. And yes, it's been only 4 months, but like, I don't remember what I had to eat yesterday. So the fact that I could remember a lot of plot points and be like, oh yeah, you know, maybe I just have to like reference a little note here or there to clarify that that's what it said, or, you know, that I'm not misremembering something. I think that really speaks to how I did kind of internalize this book a lot more and clearly enjoyed it a lot more than I think I originally thought I had. There were a lot of words in that sentence. So yeah, I think this book is just very much real and unsettling and at times heartwarming and a little moving. So what's it all about? I mean, at its core, Mexican Gothic is a tale of, you know, the darkness that racism and kind of ethnocentrism and colonialism can really spread, as well as just a story about family and how, you know, we can all make the choice to either run towards darkness or run away from it. So as always, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, and in the comments let me know what you are going to dress up for Halloween. I'm probably gonna go as Wednesday Addams if I do anything, because I have this dress that fits the vibe and I haven't bought a costume in years, so that's usually my go-to. Beyond that, make sure that you subscribe for more bookish content like this and hit that notification bell so you know exactly when I upload next, and I will see you all next time.